December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Imperial Japanese Navy A-6M0 fighters roll off carrier decks, their Nakajima Sakae engines cutting through Hawaiian morning air. The goal is surgical: cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and force America to negotiate from weakness. But what unfolds instead becomes the opening act of a pilot training catastrophe that will consume an entire generation of Japanese aviators. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nishizawa banks his zero low over Ford Island, his 700 hours of flight training evident in every precise movement as anti-aircraft fire blooms around his aircraft like deadly flowers. The 23-year-old naval aviator represents the pinnacle of Japanese pilot development, a product of the most rigorous aviation training program in the world. Yet within 4 years, men like Nishizawa will be dead, and the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service will be throwing teenage boys with 40 hours of training into suicide missions because there is simply no one left who knows how to fight. The mathematics of this collapse are staggering and hidden in the bureaucratic language of military casualty reports, but they tell a story of systematic destruction that begins with Japan's early victories and ends with the statistical reality that haunts every serious study of Pacific War aviation. Of the 15,821 Japanese naval aviators killed between December 1941 and March 1945, the vast majority died not in glorious aerial combat but in the grinding attrition of a training system that could never replace what it lost. On that December morning, as Nishizawa's zero tears across Pearl Harbor's burning harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy fields the most experienced and capable naval aviation force in the world, with carrier pilots averaging over 700 hours of flight time and many veterans possessing over 2,000 hours from combat operations in China. These men have survived a selection process so brutal that only 1 in 10 candidates ever earn their wings, enduring a training regimen that includes beatings with wooden sticks for minor infractions and a culture that demands perfection or death. The system that created these pilots reflects Japanese military doctrine at its most unforgiving, where Chief Petty Officer Saburo Sakai remembers instructors hitting trainees in the head with clubs during flight training if they made errors, and where the competitive examinations for Naval Aviation School accepted only 70 men out of 1,500 applicants in 1937. This extreme selectivity produces extraordinary results in the short term, as evidenced by the Zero's early 12-to-1 kill ratio over China and the devastating effectiveness of Pearl Harbor. But it contains the seeds of its own destruction because Japan's military leadership never considers what happens when these irreplaceable pilots start dying. The first cracks in this system appear not in the skies over Pearl Harbor but in the strategic assumptions that underpin Japanese war planning, where Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's conception of a short war lasting 6 months to a year allows no room for the massive pilot training expansion that a prolonged conflict would require. Unlike the United States, which begins rapidly expanding its aviation training infrastructure even before entering the war, Japan maintains its peacetime training tempo throughout 1941 and into 1942, assuming that early victories will force American negotiations before pilot replacement becomes critical. This fundamental miscalculation becomes apparent as early as May 1942 during the Battle of the Coral Sea, where Japanese commanders at Rabaul begin complaining about the quality of replacement aircrew for their Mitsubishi G3M bombers, noting that new pilots lack the navigation skills and combat experience necessary for operations over the vast distances of the Pacific. The loss of experienced pilots in this engagement, while relatively small in absolute numbers, represents an irreplaceable diminishment of Japanese capability because the men who die cannot be quickly or adequately replaced. The catastrophe accelerates dramatically at Midway on June 4, 1942, where a single day of combat destroys not just 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, but also eliminates dozens of Japan's most experienced naval aviators in one devastating blow. Flight Petty Officer Takashi Maeda, a veteran pilot with over 1,500 hours of combat experience, dies when his Zero crashes into the sea after sustaining damage from Lieutenant Commander John Thatch's Wildcat Squadron, taking with him years of irreplaceable institutional knowledge about carrier operations and aerial combat tactics. What makes Midway particularly devastating for Japanese naval aviation is not just the loss of ships but the concentration of experience that dies with them, as each carrier air group represents the distillation of Japan's most skilled pilots and aircrew. When the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu sink beneath Pacific waters, they take with them men who possessed collective decades of combat experience that cannot be replicated in training schools, no matter how rigorous the program. The German Luftwaffe, observing Japanese pilot training through military attaché reports during 1942, expresses private concerns about the sustainability of Japan's aviation program, with General Major Adolph Galland noting in classified communications that while Japanese pilots demonstrate exceptional individual skill, their training system lacks the mass production capability that modern aerial warfare demands. German aviation experts, themselves struggling with pilot replacement issues after heavy losses over Britain and Russia, recognize the warning signs of an aviation force that prioritizes individual excellence over systematic replacement. This German assessment proves prescient as 1942 progresses and Japanese pilot quality begins its inexorable decline, with the Guadalcanal campaign serving as a grinding mill that destroys experienced aircrews faster than they can be replaced. Operations from Rabaul to Henderson Field push Japanese pilots to their operational limits, flying missions at maximum range in aircraft lacking the fuel reserves for extended combat, forcing pilots to choose between engaging Allied fighters and having enough fuel to return to base. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, flying from Rabaul during the August 1942 Eastern Solomons campaign, exemplifies both the skill of Japan's remaining elite pilots and the impossible operational demands being placed upon them. During a mission to attack Allied positions on Guadalcanal, Sakai engages multiple American Wildcats while nursing his Zero through nearly 4 hours of flight time, demonstrating the extraordinary endurance and skill that Japanese training produces. Yet such missions are unsustainable because they require pilots to operate at their absolute limits day after day. The statistical reality of Japanese pilot losses during the Solomons campaign reveals the mathematical impossibility of sustaining such operations, with the Imperial Japanese Navy losing approximately 200 experienced pilots per month throughout the latter half of 1942, while training schools produce fewer than 50 replacement pilots monthly. This gap between loss and replacement creates a death spiral where inexperienced pilots are rushed into combat before completing their training, leading to higher casualty rates and accelerating the degradation of overall pilot quality. Italian Regia Aeronautica observers, stationed at Japanese bases during 1942 as part of Axis military cooperation agreements, report back to Rome about the concerning trends they witness in Japanese pilot training and operational tempo. Colonel Alessio Ferretti, serving as an aviation liaison with the Imperial Japanese Navy, notes in classified reports that Japanese pilots are flying far more combat missions per month than their Italian or German counterparts, leading to exhaustion and degraded performance that Italian doctrine would consider operationally unacceptable. These Italian observations carry particular weight because the Regia Aeronautica has developed its own understanding of pilot sustainability through operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean, where Italian pilots flying the Macchi C-202 achieve kill ratios of 44-1 against Desert Air Force opponents while maintaining sustainable operational tempos. The Italian experience suggests that pilot effectiveness requires careful management of combat exposure and adequate rest periods, concepts that Japanese operational doctrine largely ignores in favor of maximum effort missions. By early 1943, the crisis in Japanese pilot quality becomes impossible to ignore, with Allied pilots beginning to report noticeable declines in their opponents' flying skills and tactical awareness. Commander David McCampbell, flying with Air Group 15 from the USS Essex, observes during early 1943 engagements that Japanese pilots are making fundamental errors in formation flying and combat tactics that would have been unthinkable among the elite aviators encountered in 1941 and early 1942. The training system itself begins to collapse under the pressure of accelerated production timelines and fuel shortages that limit flight training hours, with the Imperial Japanese Navy reducing pilot training from the pre-war standard of 700 hours to approximately 300 hours by mid-1943. This reduction might seem modest on paper, but it eliminates crucial advanced training phases where pilots develop the instinctive responses and tactical awareness necessary for survival in aerial combat. Flight instructors at Kasumigaura Naval Air Training Center report increasing difficulty in maintaining training standards as fuel allocations decrease and pressure mounts to graduate pilots more quickly, with many instructors expressing private concerns that students are being sent to operational units without mastering basic combat maneuvers. Warrant Officer Kiyoshi Ito, a former China veteran serving as a flight instructor, notes in his personal diary that students in late 1943 possess perhaps 1/4 the flying ability of pre-war graduates, yet operational demands require their immediate assignment to combat units. The German Luftwaffe faces similar pressures during the same period, with training hours for fighter pilots dropping from an early war standard of over 400 hours to approximately 160 hours by 1944, Yet German training still exceeds Japanese standards because the Luftwaffe maintains larger numbers of training aircraft and more extensive simulator programs. German pilot training reports from 1943 indicate recognition that reduced training hours represent a temporary emergency measure rather than a sustainable long-term policy, while Japanese naval aviation appears to accept degraded training as an operational necessity. This difference in approach reflects broader strategic thinking about the war's duration and resource allocation, with German planners maintaining hope for technological solutions and defensive strategies that could restore aviation effectiveness, while Japanese leadership increasingly views pilot training as a luxury that cannot be afforded given the immediate tactical demands of Pacific operations. The result is a systematic degradation of Japanese pilot capability that accelerates throughout 1943 and becomes catastrophic by 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provides the most dramatic illustration of how far Japanese pilot quality has fallen, when Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet launches over 400 aircraft against Task Force 58 in what becomes known to American aviators as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The engagement reveals not just American technological and numerical superiority, but the complete collapse of Japanese pilot training standards, as many of Ozawa's pilots possess fewer than 100 hours of flight time and have never participated in large-scale carrier operations. Lieutenant Commander Alexander Vreshu, flying a Grumman F-6F Hellcat from the USS Lexington, shoots down 6 Japanese aircraft during the June 19 engagement, later describing the experience as unlike any previous aerial combat because the Japanese pilots appear fundamentally unprepared for modern fighter tactics. Vreshu notes that enemy pilots are flying in formations too tight for effective mutual support and failing to execute basic defensive maneuvers when attacked, suggesting a level of training inadequacy that would have been impossible among pre-war Japanese aviators. The statistical results of the Philippine Sea engagement underscore the magnitude of Japanese pilot training collapse, with American forces destroying approximately 600 Japanese aircraft over 2 days while losing only 123 planes in return. More significantly, the loss of nearly 3,000 experienced Japanese pilots and aircrew in this single engagement effectively eliminates Japan's remaining reservoir of trained naval aviators, forcing subsequent operations to rely on minimally trained replacements and hastily converted flight instructors. Flight Petty Officer Zenji Abe, one of the few experienced Japanese pilots to survive the Philippine Sea engagement, later describes the battle as witnessing the death of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force, noting that the pilots lost represented years of accumulated experience that could never be replaced given Japan's deteriorating training infrastructure and fuel shortages. Abe's account emphasizes that many of the dead pilots were themselves recent graduates pressed into service before completing advanced training, creating a situation where Japan was losing pilots it had never properly trained. The German Luftwaffe, facing its own crisis of pilot quality during 1944, studies Japanese losses at the Philippine Sea as a cautionary example of what happens when pilot training completely breaks down. German aviation staff reports from late 1944 note that while Luftwaffe pilot training has been severely reduced, it still maintains standards that exceed late-war Japanese practices, suggesting that German leadership recognizes the Philippine Sea as an example of institutional failure rather than inevitable military reality. Italian military observers, now operating under the constraints of Italy's 1943 armistice and partition, continue to monitor Axis aviation developments through clandestine intelligence networks and express particular concern about Japanese pilot training practices. Reports reaching the Italian co-belligerent Air Force indicate that Japanese aviation has entered a death spiral where inadequate training produces higher casualty rates, which in turn necessitate even more abbreviated training programs to meet replacement demands. By late 1944, the collapse of Japanese pilot training reaches its logical conclusion with the introduction of systematic kamikaze operations, where suicide attacks represent not just tactical desperation but acknowledgement that Japan no longer possesses pilots capable of conventional aerial warfare. The TACO or Special Attack Corps pilots receive as little as 40 hours of flight training, focusing primarily on basic takeoff and navigation skills while ignoring advanced combat maneuvers entirely, because their missions require only the ability to fly aircraft into enemy ships. Flight training for kamikaze pilots, conducted at bases like Chiran and Kanoya, represents the ultimate degradation of Japanese naval aviation, where young men barely out of their teens receive minimal instruction in aircraft operation before being sent on one-way missions against Allied invasion fleets. Petty Officer Yukio Araki, training at Chiran Air Base during the preparation for Operation Tengo, writes to his family that most pilots in his unit have never attempted a carrier landing or engaged in aerial combat, yet they are expected to successfully attack heavily defended American task forces. The contrast between these hastily trained kamikaze pilots and the elite aviators who attacked Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier illustrates the complete institutional collapse of Japanese naval aviation, where a system that once produced the world's most skilled carrier pilots is reduced to training suicide bombers with basic flying skills. This transformation occurs not through enemy action but through the systematic destruction of Japan's training infrastructure and the irreplaceable loss of experienced instructors and veteran pilots. German aviation intelligence reports from early 1945 describe Japanese kamikaze operations as evidence of complete institutional breakdown, comparing the situation unfavorably to even the most desperate late-war Luftwaffe operations. While German pilots in 1945 often lack adequate fuel and aircraft, they maintain basic flying competency and tactical awareness that Japanese kamikaze pilots completely lack, suggesting that the German training system, despite severe degradation, never reaches the state of complete collapse seen in Japanese naval aviation. The statistical analysis of Japanese pilot casualties reveals the mathematical precision of this institutional destruction, with Imperial Japanese Navy aviation losing 15,821 killed personnel between December 1941 and March 1945, representing nearly complete turnover of the service's pilot population multiple times during the war. These numbers include 14,242 aircrew and 1,579 officers, with the majority of deaths occurring during 1944 and 1945 as minimally trained pilots are fed into combat operations they are unprepared to survive. The breakdown of these casualties by year reveals the acceleration of Japanese pilot losses as training standards collapse, with 1944 accounting for approximately 40% of total wartime aviation deaths despite representing only 1 year of a 4-year conflict. This concentration of losses reflects not just increased Allied effectiveness, but the reality that poorly trained pilots die at vastly higher rates than their experienced predecessors, creating a feedback loop where declining training standards produce higher casualty rates. Kamikaze operations alone account for 3,913 pilot deaths, representing a complete loss ratio for these missions while achieving only marginal tactical results against Allied naval forces. The 19% success rate for kamikaze attacks, while statistically significant, represents an enormous waste of human resources that Japan could not afford, particularly given that many of these pilots possessed enough basic flying ability to contribute meaningfully to conventional operations if properly trained and equipped. The comparison with Allied pilot training reveals the magnitude of Japan's institutional failure, as American naval aviators entering combat in 1944 typically possess over 500 hours of flight training, including extensive practice in carrier operations, gunnery, and formation flying. British and Australian pilots operating in the Pacific similarly benefit from comprehensive training programs that maintain pre-war standards despite wartime pressures, suggesting that adequate pilot training remains achievable even under difficult circumstances. German pilot training, while severely degraded by 1944, still produces aviators with approximately 160 hours of flight experience, significantly exceeding late-war Japanese standards and maintaining basic competency in aircraft operation and tactical awareness. The contrast between German and Japanese pilot training during the final year of the war illustrates that while resource constraints inevitably reduce training quality, complete institutional collapse remains avoidable through proper planning and resource allocation. Italian aviation experts, analyzing post-war data about Axis pilot training programs, conclude that Japanese naval aviation suffered from fundamental strategic errors in manpower planning that compounded the effects of tactical defeats and resource shortages. The Italian assessment emphasizes that while defeat in the Pacific was probably inevitable given American industrial capacity, the magnitude of Japanese pilot losses resulted from systematic failures in training policy rather than purely military factors. The personal accounts of surviving Japanese pilots provide insight into the human cost of this training collapse, with veterans like Saburo Sakae describing the psychological impact of watching an entire generation of aviators disappear while being replaced by inadequately trained young men sent to certain death. Sakae's post-war memoirs emphasize that experienced pilots recognized the futility of late-war operations but remained powerless to prevent the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation. Flight instructor accounts from training bases like Kasumigaura reveal the institutional pressure that drove training standards downward, with veteran pilots forced to graduate students they knew were unprepared for combat operations. Warrant Officer Masanobu Ibusuki, serving as a flight instructor during 1944, describes the moral anguish of sending 18-year-old pilots to operational units while knowing they lacked the skills necessary for survival, yet being unable to extend training due to operational demands. The strategic implications of Japanese pilot training collapse extend beyond aviation to encompass Japan's entire approach to warfare, where the systematic destruction of institutional knowledge and training capability represents a form of national suicide that parallels the individual suicide attacks of kamikaze operations. The loss of 15,000 trained pilots represents not just tactical defeat but the elimination of a generation of technical expertise that required decades to develop. Post-war analysis by Allied intelligence services reveals that Japanese pilot training collapse began as early as mid-1942 but accelerated dramatically following the carrier losses at Midway and the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign. The Allied assessment emphasizes that while Japanese industrial capacity and fuel shortages contributed to training degradation, the primary cause was strategic miscalculation about the war's duration and the importance of maintaining pilot training infrastructure. The comparison with German aviation reveals that while the Luftwaffe also suffered from reduced training standards and fuel shortages, German leadership maintained greater awareness of pilot training requirements and attempted to preserve institutional capability even under extreme pressure. The German approach, while ultimately unsuccessful, suggests that pilot training collapse was not inevitable even under wartime conditions, making Japanese failures appear more significant. German post-war assessments of Japanese aviation emphasize the contrast between Japan's early excellence and subsequent collapse, noting that the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed superior pilot training to any other air force in 1941 but completely abandoned the systematic approach that created this excellence under operational pressure. The German analysis suggests that Japanese leadership failed to understand that pilot training represents a strategic asset requiring long-term investment rather than a tactical resource that can be sacrificed for immediate needs. The final accounting of Japanese pilot losses reveals that approximately 90% of pilots entering combat after mid-1943 were killed during their service, with the highest casualty rates among the minimally trained aviators rushed into service during 1944 and 1945. This statistic encompasses not just kamikaze pilots but conventional aviators who lacked the training necessary to survive in increasingly hostile skies dominated by experienced Allied pilots flying superior aircraft. The mathematics of this destruction are straightforward and terrible. Japan began the Pacific War with approximately 3,000 trained naval aviators and lost over 15,000 pilots during the conflict, indicating multiple complete turnovers of the pilot population as training standards collapsed and casualty rates soared. The majority of these deaths occurred among pilots with fewer than 100 hours of training, men who never had a realistic chance of survival in modern aerial combat. The strategic lesson of Japanese pilot training collapse extends beyond World War II to encompass fundamental questions about institutional resilience and the importance of maintaining training standards even under extreme pressure. The Japanese experience demonstrates that short-term operational gains achieved through degraded training standards ultimately produce catastrophic long-term consequences that can destroy entire military institutions. The human cost of this collapse cannot be measured solely in statistical terms, as each pilot death represents not just a tactical loss but the elimination of years of training investment and the destruction of irreplaceable experience. The young men who died in kamikaze attacks during 1945 possessed the same basic human potential as the elite pilots who dominated Pacific skies in 1941, yet they were denied the training and experience that might have allowed them to contribute meaningfully to Japan's defense. In the end, the story of Japanese pilot training collapse represents one of the most complete institutional failures in military history, where a system that produced the world's finest naval aviators destroyed itself through strategic miscalculation and the abandonment of the very principles that created its early excellence. The 90% casualty rate among Japanese pilots reflects not just tactical defeat but systematic failure to understand that military effectiveness requires sustainable institutions rather than heroic individuals. The legacy of this collapse extends beyond the Pacific War to influence post-war aviation training philosophy, where the Japanese experience serves as a cautionary example of what happens when operational demands override institutional preservation. The destruction of Japanese naval aviation stands as testament to the truth that military excellence cannot be sustained without systematic attention to training, experience, and institutional knowledge, lessons that remain relevant for any military organization facing the pressures of modern warfare. The final Zero fighters that surrendered in August 1945 were flown by pilots who bore no resemblance to the elite aviators who attacked Pearl Harbor 4 years earlier, representing the complete transformation of an institution from world-class excellence to systematic dysfunction. The contrast between these endpoints illustrates the speed with which military institutions can collapse when training standards are abandoned and experienced personnel are consumed by unsustainable operational demands. This transformation from elite force to kamikaze squadrons represents more than military defeat. It embodies the destruction of institutional memory and the abandonment of systematic excellence in favor of desperate expedients that could never replace the careful development of professional competence. The Japanese experience demonstrates that in warfare, as in other complex human endeavors, there are no shortcuts to excellence and no substitutes for systematic training and institutional preservation. The 90% casualty rate among Japanese Zero pilots ultimately reflects not just American superiority but Japanese institutional suicide, where a military organization systematically destroyed its own capacity for effectiveness through strategic miscalculation and the abandonment of the training standards that created its initial success. This lesson transcends the specific circumstances of the Pacific War to offer broader insights about institutional resilience and the importance of maintaining professional standards even under extreme pressure. The story ends where it began, with mathematics and institutional choices, but the numbers that matter are not just casualty statistics but the systematic decisions that transformed the world's finest naval aviation force into a collection of suicide bombers barely capable of basic flight operations. The Japanese lost 90% of their Zero pilots not through superior enemy action alone but through the systematic destruction of their own institutional capacity to train and develop effective military aviators. The silence that followed Japan's surrender in August 1945 was not just the absence of war but the institutional quiet of a military aviation system that had consumed itself completely, leaving behind only the statistical record of its own destruction and the testimony of a few survivors who witnessed the transformation of excellence into catastrophe. In the end, the greatest tragedy of Japanese pilot training collapse was not the tactical defeat it ensured but the institutional suicide it represented, the systematic abandonment of the very principles and standards that had once made Japanese naval aviation the finest in the world.